Sorbo.
All right, welcome back to the program. I am so thrilled to welcome my next guest. Now, I promised you guys we were going to get serious in the second half of today's show, and we are, because my guest is the author of the highly acclaimed The Legacy of Jihad, Islamic Holy War and the Fate of Non-Muslims. He's also written The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, From Sacred Texts to Solemn History, and Sharia versus Freedom, The Legacy of Islamic Totalitarianism. No, we are not going to talk about how to make saltwater taffy. You might have guessed there's a theme, and we're going to be talking about that with Dr. Andrew Bostom, who has also published numerous articles and commentaries on Islam in the New York Post, Washington Times, New York Daily News, National Review Online, The American Thinker, Pajamas Media, Front Page Magazine, and many others. He's prolific, and I'm so thrilled. And it's been a while, Andy, since I've had you on the show, because, of course, I shut down the show for a couple years in between. But it is my pleasure to welcome you back to the Sam Sorbo Show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
So this is a problem that's not going away, but let's start at the beginning and this latest piece that you've written and what's sort of now the new happenings in this jihad war that it seems people don't quite understand.
Right. Well, we just got an inkling of it. I don't know if you heard the response of Mahmoud Abbas to the latest peace, rational peace plan proposal was 1,000 no's. So that's didn't take very long for that one. But I think it's part of the way the part of the way Islam conceives of the struggle between, the so-called local struggle between the Israelis and the Palestinian Muslims is really gives you an insight into the larger, unfortunate issue of how Islam views the Jews. And what I tried to do in this book is sort of update it from the original 2008 publication of The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, by focusing on, my background is also mainly in medicine and epidemiology. And since the first publication of the book, there's been a tremendous amount of data that have been produced by an organization that, is certainly to the left of me politically, and I often disagree, the Anti-Defamation League, but they happen to do outstanding surveys of anti-Semitic attitudes across the world. And they've developed a very simple, straightforward scale. They present to each person they survey 11 anti-Semitic stereotypes. And if that person has to agree with at least 6 or more of the anti-Semitic stereotypes to become indexed as a case, and they call it extreme anti-Semitism, and I think that's a reasonable definition. Anyway, they apply this questionnaire, they get the responses literally across the world. And since 2014, in the latest version of this questionnaire, it's overwhelmingly a Muslim problem. Obviously, anti-Semitism exists outside the Muslim community and Muslim nations. But the 16 most anti-Semitic countries in the world are all in the Muslim Middle East, where the occurrence of this degree of anti-Semitism is anywhere from 74 to 93%. I mean, there's nothing like that in a group of countries outside the Middle East. When you start to look at the Muslim populations that have emigrated outside the Middle East, so for example, in Western Europe, and I'll come to the United States at the end, but in Western Europe, the last 2 surveys that the ADL has done, including one that was just reported in the fall, in November, show that 50 to 55% of the Muslim populations in these Western European nations have this degree of anti-Semitism, again, extreme anti-Semitism. And that's about 2 to 3-fold the background rate in the non-Muslim populations in Europe. And finally, Sam, the most recent data we have from the United States come from a survey that the ADL did in the end of 2016 to the beginning of 2017 And this is a much more philo-Semitic country, largely, I think, because of the evangelical Christian community, which is so big. But at any rate, the background rate may be a little higher than you might suspect. It's about 14%. But amongst Muslims already in this country, it's 34%. So it's very consistent with the worldwide trend of being, 2 to 3-fold greater than any other population you study.
Let me ask you this. Is it greater? Is there a trend that it is greater just in the United States over time, that it has increased over time?
No, actually, overall anti-Semitism in the United States has kind of leveled off. It may be rising a little bit again. It's certainly, now that there's a Muslim population in the United States that can be sampled and is growing. If it continues to exhibit, at least some reflection of the attitudes in the Muslim population across the world, and that population grows in the U.S., you can only expect it to increase.
Right, but at this point, it's nominal. What we're experiencing.
Right.
But I mean, don't you struggle with the anti-Semitism that exists just in the New York Times?
Right. In other words, there are all kinds of anti-Semitism from the right, from the left, but from other faiths. But the point is, ADL assesses all of them. And what stands out in our era is the anti-Semitism that's coming from Islam, and it begets violence. That's the other thing that we're learning from Europe now, and obviously the Middle East. But outside the Middle East, when you look at the few surveys in Europe that have been done, this is non-lethal violence, because what they're doing is they're querying the victims. So when you look at the few surveys that have been done in Europe where Jewish victims have been queried and asked to identify who was the victimizer, there the rates are like 3 to 10-fold that it was a Muslim victimizer. And for this book, I updated since 9/11. There have been, it's not well publicized, but there have been 23 jihadist attacks targeting Jews since 9/11. 16, fortunately, were thwarted. Seven were quote unquote successful and completed. And the latest one of those was the attack on the Muncie, New York synagogue.
Right.
Grafton Thomas had two sources, a police source, and then his stepfather for 10 years was a Muslim convert.
Wow. That's okay. So what do we do with this information?
Well, so, I've been very curious now about a phenomenon that took place. It was building up, during the World War II era and, mushroomed after it, which was a self-examination.
That was not a good pun.
No. I'm talking about, no, I'm not talking about Japan. I'm talking about really the other theater of the war,
sure,
which was in Europe. And it was a movement within the Catholic Church to begin to address the canonical anti-Semitism that came out of Christianity, and there was a lot of movement in that direction. And obviously, it was accelerated post World War II, and one of the main sort of Jewish input to that came from a French historian, Jules Isaac, who wrote a very interesting book called Jesus and Israel, and basically what he did is go through the commentaries mostly on the New Testament and some of the teachings in schools. He felt, frankly, that the texts themselves were often just elusive. It was really the gloss that was given on these texts that was causing a lot of the Christian anti-Semitism that had persisted over the centuries. And he literally had audiences with Pope Pius and ultimately with Pope John the 23rd, and there were radical changes in the teachings. And so I think what this process that led to Nostra Aetate and Vatican II really has to be applied in its infancy now to the institutions, to the Islamic religious teaching institutions, which unfiltered are still pouring out the traditional Quranic themes and the glosses on these themes, the themes from the Hadith, the traditions of Muhammad that are virulently anti-Semitic. In 2013, Sam, the current Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University, which is the Sunni Vatican equivalent, and he's the Sunni papal equivalent, Ahmed Al-Tayeb, just sat down and nonchalantly gave an interview on Egyptian TV, a live interview, and he said, look, this verse in the Quran, it's in the 5th surah chapter, the 82nd verse, which is kind of a psychological projection verse. It claims that the Jews hold the greatest enmity towards the Muslims. He said it defined the relationship between the Muslims and Jews for 14 centuries and had caused the Muslims great anguish. He equated Zionists and Jews, Zionism and Judaism, and said that, to his audience that this still defines the relationship. And no one challenged him. And I'm talking about challenges from the Jewish community. There's silence when these types of interviews are given, let alone when all the teaching that still goes on in these institutions, both Sunni and Shiite. And so I think that's where it's got to start. It's no one's responsibility more than it is Jewish leadership responsibility to confront these institutions that are still teaching in this manner.
How would you recommend that they confront? I tend to agree with you. I mean, if you won't stand up for yourself, nobody else is going to stand up for you. That sort of goes. That's sort of the unwritten rule of law, in a sense. But
I'm talking about very basic acknowledgement, Sam. And so what happened? I was waiting for someone, and what happened was nothing was forthcoming. And so I actually wrote to Geert Wilders. Now that might seem an interesting choice, but at least I knew he's a very courageous man, and he's actually studied Islam. And despite all the demonization, I know him not to be the caricature. And he was very upset by this, and he literally sat down and wrote a letter. Not only to the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University, he addressed it to Pope Francis at the same time and said, you have to address this simultaneously, both of you. And, it didn't go anywhere, but I think those are the kinds of gestures that are needed.
Right. Talk to me about this article that you've written. It's up right now. Well, it's up on Ruthfully Yours. Right. Well, there's a little behind the scenes stuff going on. I won't get into that right now, but at any rate, essentially there was this much ballyhooed visit by the Muslim World League to Auschwitz a little bit before yesterday was the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz at the end of World War II, and in looking into the atmospherics around this, it was very upsetting to me. First of all, Sam, the Muslim World League for 60 years, until maybe 2 years ago, was just a full-throated jihadist, Wahhabist, Muslim Brotherhood organization involved in all the things that you would expect that type of organization to be. Allegedly, they're trying to reform themselves, in Saudi Arabia. It's not going well, is the gist of what I found out in researching this article, and it looks to be, a lot of it is just window dressing. But regardless, when you look at the tour that this group was on, Auschwitz is just a stop on a tour of other crises. And it's really a dawah tour. It's really a proselytization tour. And one of the places that they're comparing Auschwitz to, I couldn't believe this, was Srebrenica. Now, if you recall, during the very bloody civil war that took place in Bosnia between the Serbs and the Bosnian Muslims, there were all kinds of tit-for-tat massacres, including one at Srebrenica, which was a massacre of Muslims. And the estimates keep fluctuating. There's somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 Muslims, Muslim fighting age males that were slaughtered. They were clearly slaughtered. But that in the midst of a civil war, that being compared to the Holocaust just struck me as beyond the pale. And yet that is what this tour was all about, which was welcomed
the Muslim contingent was welcomed by the American Jewish Committee. So I wrote about that and the various statements that the leader of this Muslim tour had written. He wrote a letter to the Holocaust Museum of the United States 2 years ago. And in this letter, which was supposed to be so wonderful, the word Jews doesn't appear in his letter. It's a catastrophe that took place. I mean, it was absolutely striking. Yeah, but the really, and you know what? From his perspective, honestly, from his perspective as a Muslim, I could see him talking that way. He was arguing basically that this is against everything Islam represents. Islam doesn't believe in these kinds of, human self-inflict, these human calamities that mankind inflicts against each other, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Islam is a wonderful, peaceful religion. It's against its tenets, et cetera, et cetera. That's not a discussion of the Holocaust per se. Of course, there is a legacy he could have talked about. With Haj Amin al-Husani being an ally of Hitler during World War II, with the mass number of Nazis that survived World War II that escaped and thrived in the Middle East, contributing to the jihad against Israel. None of that mea culpa was apparent, but it was worse yet. It was almost as if this was all a Muslim dawah tour, dating back to this initial letter, which set the whole vision in place.
It was almost as if the Jewish community were complicit because they refused to even comment on it. And I think that it stems from, and I'm going out on a limb because I don't know all the particulars. You're the expert here, but I see it in the conservative community. I see it in the Christian community. I see this sort of we're happy for just the crumbs that drop off the table. So, we ask for, I just interviewed a young girl who was basically abused in her high school class, and they asked for an apology from the professor, and he wrote a sorry, not sorry letter. Like, I'm deeply saddened that my actions have caused you some discomfort. But basically, it's your problem, like that kind of letter. And the school refused to do anything about it. And she is back in school. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, so you got no satisfaction, but you capitulated. And I think that we've just gotten used to that. We're just like, well, and it's part of a normalization. I love that word, normalization, because by the time that I figured out, but the first time I heard it, and then, over time I realized the normalization, that's how they win. It's the salami tactic. They do a little bit and then they win. And so I think we're at this point where the Jewish population is just happy that they're acknowledging that something happened at Auschwitz. Like, well, thank goodness they're seeing that there's something that happened.
These guys, in the estimate of the American Jewish Committee, at least these guys weren't rushing off to Iran to participate in yet another Holocaust denial conference. Right. So this is a lot better than that. But on the other hand, whether it's gullibility, whether it's just denial, when I looked at, because the Arab press is where I found these stories, that this was just part of a series of visits to the places of, human catastrophes. And again, Sam, including Srebrenica. And stepping back and putting myself in the position of this Muslim delegation, I don't think it's too far-fetched to say that to them, let's use the upper figure, the 7,000 Muslims that were killed in Srebrenica, regardless of the context, and it was a civil war, but the 7,000 Muslims that were brutally killed during that episode of the Civil War are in fact equivalent to the 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, as far as they're concerned. I don't think that it may strike us as incredible, but I don't say that that's necessarily beyond the pale for their particular mindset. It is a supremacist mindset.
Well, okay. And I'm not sure how to comment on that, but I look at that and I say, and as long as nobody corrects them, then they basically have a right to that opinion. You know what I mean? Like,
exactly.
So,
exactly.
but then again, to play devil's advocate, Andy, think about this. Think about, at least they are acknowledging Auschwitz. They are acknowledging the Holocaust. They are saying, okay, this was a horrible catastrophe that happened here. Do we want to sort of slap them in the face and say, it's worse than that? I'm not sure.
Well, my point, my article was addressing the American Jewish Committee, and that's what really caused the fuss.
Right.
Because I don't think it's the responsibility. I'm perfectly willing to take. You're right, but it is some sort of a gesture. It's the way it's presented. It's the 2 years that led up, because this was planned. There was that initial letter to the Holocaust Museum in the United States, which put this guy on the map, and then there was a memorandum of understanding between the American Jewish Committee and the Muslim World League, or the new Muslim World League, in April of last year. And when you read that memorandum of understanding, once again, it's basically a dawa document that, yes, there are these tragedies, hold
on. You're using the word dawa, and you've used it more than once. And I think that we understand what it means, but why don't you go into a little bit better of a definition of what is dawa? What do you mean by dawa?
It's basically proselytization to advance Islam, to advance things like conversion to Islam primarily.
So in other words, hey, look how sympathetic we are and how sad we are about atrocities that have happened. That's what makes Islam the greatest religion.
Absolutely. You that's it. That's it. And so why, and by the way, I don't, again, from the perspective of a man like Alisa and the new Muslim World League, that is a very traditional belief. It really is. There is, I think, an element of cynicism that we should be suspicious of too. But it is, on the other hand, it is a belief. It's a superior belief system. This is yet another demonstration of it. And let's go. We'll go to Auschwitz, but we're also going to go to Srebrenica to show you that, these things are committed against Muslims too.
And and of course, the difference is that in Srebrenica, it was, it sounds horrible, but it was sort of tit for tat.
Absolutely was tit for tat. I mean, there's no denying that. This was a full-blown civil war. And you have to, you have to go back. It was war.
Auschwitz,
and you also have to go back to the history. Yeah.
Sorry, but Auschwitz, you cannot make that same argument. Well, it was war.
No.
They had to kill the Jews because the Jews were attacking it. No, I'm sorry. No, you can't make that claim. They targeted the Jews. Right. They targeted homosexuals just to be, they targeted the clergy. They targeted and said these people are marked for extinction. Not let's start a war with them and see who wins, which arguably that's what wars are, right? It wasn't that at all. It wasn't even close to that. And of course, it started with the Jews. It was predominantly the Jews. It ended with the Jews, and it ended with millions and millions of. I mean, it's a completely different scenario, which is, of course, why you're so upset and why it seems so odd that the Jewish community wouldn't be at least a little bit up in arms. But I have a feeling that they've normalized it somehow. And
I'm a target now. I mean, I don't know how this is going to play out, but I'm a target for writing this op-ed. So, and that's actually quite typical of these Jewish organizations as well. In other words, and part of their mission for 75 years since the end of since Auschwitz was liberated was to, for better or for worse, to highlight the absolute singularity of the Holocaust. And lo and behold, they have an event like this, which is antithetical to that principle. It's being compared to Srebrenica.
Right. Right. It is beyond the pale, but it's good that you're out there and that you're writing this, and you should write more. You should just write another one and say, I don't understand. I hope that somebody reaches out to me from this organization and we can have a conversation about the benefits that they perceive because I don't perceive the same benefits clearly. Maybe I'm missing something.
Also, but there's a whole series of things they're not doing. I mean, if we're going to deal with this in the context of the Holocaust, then why aren't there exhibits at so-called Holocaust museums which elaborate the role of Haj Amin al-Husseini during World War II, which talk about what happened after World War II, where Nazis that survived were granted safe haven, particularly in Egypt, and actually did things like help train the military, run propaganda ministries, etc. I mean, that should all be part of this discussion too. It's not a purely European problem.
Right. And somebody needs to bring that to their attention. But these are uncomfortable conversations. Isn't that
Very
sad? It's like, well, I'm uncomfortable, so it's not worth. And
they're made more uncomfortable, Sam, by the fact that, again, bringing us back to where we started, that right now, forget about 75 years ago. Right now, it is unquestionable. All the metrics show it, that the most virulent form of anti-Semitism right now is coming from the Muslim community. There's no question about it.
Right. Well, right. Well, look, the whole point of the two-state solution is so that there's an opportunity to wipe out Israel. I mean, that's what come on. Really? We're going to, dance around this? But no, let's just talk about it, right?
Well, look, even, you can, and again, it's a top-down, bottoms-up phenomenon. When about 9 months before the Sinai War broke out in 1956, the Suez Canal War. The Al-Azhar University and the Grand Mufti of Egypt. So they operate, in different. So one is a government employee, the other is the university, and they worked together though, and they issued joint fatwas, religious rulings, where they said, again, Israel at this point, Israel is a rump state within the 1949 armistice borders. Egypt controls Gaza, Jordan controls Judea and Samaria, and even at that point, Al-Azhar and the Grand Mufti of Egypt jointly issue these fatwas, which say that jihad for the liberation of the territory that Israel controlled at the beginning of 1956 is mandatory for Muslims across the world. I mean, so that tells you that, and it's very specific, that the Jews should only be allowed to live under the Sharia. Right. In a portion of their no portion of their ancestral homeland should they be allowed autonomous control free of Sharia jurisdiction. That's really what the fatwa says, and it also gets into conspiracies, sort of the conspiratorial Jew hatred that's unfortunately hardwired in, that they've been plotting against Islam, since the beginning.
Yeah. I'm not surprised. And it's good to bring this to light. Listen, we're running out of time. Dr. Andrew Bostom has written the book, The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism from Sacred Text to Solemn History. It is a copious book full of information, very well researched. You've done an amazing job. I'm so glad to see that you're bringing it out again with some updates in it. The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism from Sacred Text to Solemn History. Andrew Bostom, thank you so much for coming on the Sam Sorbo Show.
Thanks for having me on.
Folks, that's my show today. Go off and have a great rest of your day. This is the Sam Sorbo Show on mojo50.com, also available at mikeonline.com.